Drop Mount Everest into the deepest place human beings have ever found, somewhere in the western Pacific Ocean, and the summit, the point climbers risk their lives to stand on, would still disappear more than a mile beneath the surface. The tallest mountain on Earth would drown completely, with room left over above it. That is how far down this goes. And here is the part that should unsettle you. We do not actually know exactly how deep it is. We have stood on the moon and measured it. We have mapped the far side of Mars. But the single lowest point on our own planet, a place that has been hunted for, dived into, and blasted with sound for nearly 150 years, still has no final, agreed-upon depth. Not because nobody has tried. Because every time we measure it, the answer moves. There are no fish at the very bottom, none. A pressure that would collapse your lungs in less than a second, water barely above freezing, darkness so total that an eye has no use down there, and yet, somehow, life. Not a trace of it. Thousands of kinds. And most of them have no name, because no human being had ever seen them until a few years ago. This is the bottom of the world. And almost nothing you have been told about it is the whole story. So here is what we are going to take apart, one piece at a time. First, why the deepest place on Earth refuses to give us a straight number. Second, what actually rules the bottom, because it is not what you are picturing, and the reason no fish can survive down there alongside it is genuinely strange. And third, the part nobody expects, that the most remote, most untouched sounding place on the entire planet already has our garbage sitting in it. Chemicals we banned 50 years ago are resting at the bottom of the world right now. Start with the depth, because even that is a kind of trick. The trench is a long, curved scar across the floor of the Pacific, more than 2,500 kilometers from end to end, a crack in the planet's crust where one enormous slab is slowly grinding underneath another, and has been for around 50 million years. The deepest part of that crack has a name. The Challenger Deep. And the way it got that name is something most people get backwards. In 1875, a British survey ship called HMS Challenger sailed over this stretch of ocean, dropped a weighted rope over the side, and let it sink. The rope came back having measured something close to 8,000 meters. For the time, it was almost unbelievable. It was also wrong, a serious underestimate. A rope falling through deep water does not fall straight, currents drag it sideways, and there was no way to see the bottom or know whether the weight had truly reached it. They had found the deepest place on Earth, and still managed to undercount it by kilometers. It took 76 years before anyone did better. Then came sonar, a pulse of sound fired straight down and timed on its journey back up. Sound travels faster and straighter than any rope, and the depth jumped to something much closer to the truth. But here is what happened next, and it is the strange part. The number kept changing. Every new expedition, every new instrument, a slightly different figure, over and over, for decades. Since the 1950s, there have been more than 20 separate scientific estimates of how deep the Challenger Deep actually is. And they disagree not by centimeters, but by tens of meters. The reason is almost funny once you understand it. The deepest part of the trench is not a single point. It is a basin roughly 40 kilometers wide, a vast dark plain where several different spots are all nearly the same staggering depth. Finding the one lowest place in all of that and proving it is the lowest is far harder than it sounds. And there is a cruel piece of physics underneath it. The deeper you measure, the larger your possible error grows. At nearly 11 kilometers down, even the best modern instruments can be off by several meters. The most precise recent work puts the deepest point at around 10,935 meters, give or take a few meters. Almost 7 miles, straight down. More than 2 kilometers deeper than Mount Everest is tall. But notice the words that keep appearing. Around. Give or take. The deepest place on Earth still does not have a final, settled number, and the scientists who study it will be the first to tell you so. We have a more exact figure for the height of a mountain than for the depth of our own ocean floor. Now hold that thought, because we are about to go down there ourselves. Subscribe to Uncharted Depths, because in the next few minutes I am going to show you the exact depth where a fish's body simply stops working, the 5-centimeter creature that rules everything below that line. And why this crushing, lifeless-sounding pit turned out to be one of the most contaminated places anywhere on the planet. Let's talk about the pressure first, because it is the thing that makes everything else down there make sense. At the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the weight of the water overhead presses down with a force of more than 15,000 pounds on every single square inch. That is roughly 8 tons squeezing every patch of surface the size of your thumbnail, the weight of dozens of large aircraft, balanced on a fingertip. More than 1,000 times the pressure you are sitting in right now. If you were somehow lowered to that depth without protection, you would not drift gently down to the seabed. The pressure would force the air out of your body almost instantly. And that is why, for most of human history, no one went. Reaching the bottom is not a quick plunge. A vessel built to survive it sinks for around 4 hours just to get there, 4 hours of falling through water that grows colder and blacker with every meter. Within the first 10 minutes, the last of the sunlight is gone, and it does not come back. By the time you reach the seabed, you are in a place that has never, in the entire history of the planet, seen a single ray of light from the sun. The first machine to carry people all the way down did it in 1960. A strange, balloon-shaped vessel called the Trieste, carrying 2 men, a Swiss engineer named Jacques Picard, and a United States Navy officer named Don Walsh. They spent hours sinking into the black. And partway down, they heard a loud crack. A pane on the outer structure had fractured under the strain. They had no way to know how serious it was, and no possible rescue if it failed. They were the deepest human beings who had ever lived, sealed inside a metal sphere at the bottom of the world, listening to it groan around them. They stayed about 20 minutes. Then they went home. And then almost nobody followed. For 52 years, not a single person returned to the bottom. The next to do it was the film director James Cameron, who designed his own submersible and dived alone in 2012. After that came the explorer Victor Vescovo, who reached the bottom in 2019 and then went back, again and again, more than a dozen times. For decades, people loved to repeat a particular line, that more human beings had walked on the surface of the moon than had ever reached the deepest point of the ocean. And for a long time, that was completely true. Only a handful of people had ever touched the bottom. But it stopped being true. Vescovo's expeditions, and the ones that followed, sent so many people down that the count quietly passed the number who have walked on the moon. The fact everyone still repeats is now out of date, which tells you something about how fast this frontier is finally being crossed, and how slow it was for almost everyone else. To put it in perspective, a typical military submarine is built to survive to only about 3% of this depth. Take it much deeper than that, and it implodes. So what is waiting down there, for the people brave or reckless enough to go? Here is where almost everyone's mental picture falls apart. You are probably imagining some kind of monstrous fish, pale, fanged, glowing from within. And there are strange fish in the deep ocean. But not at the bottom, not here. Because somewhere around 8,200 meters, there is a wall, not a physical wall, a biological one. Below a certain depth, the pressure becomes so extreme that the proteins inside a fish's body can no longer hold their shape. The molecules that let a fish be a fish start to come apart. There is a hard ceiling on how deep a creature with a backbone can go, and it is thousands of meters short of the bottom. The deepest fish ever caught on camera was filmed at around 8,300 meters, but in a different trench, off the coast of Japan. And the scientists who recorded it believe it was sitting almost exactly at the limit of what any fish can physically endure. In the Mariana Trench itself, no fish has ever been seen below roughly 8,200 meters. Which means the deepest 2.5 kilometers of the ocean, the final, darkest stretch down to the very bottom, is a place no fish can reach. A zone with a backbone-shaped hole in it. So what does live there? In the part nothing with a spine can survive. Mostly, a creature about the size of your little finger, a pale, shrimp-like scavenger called an amphipod. And what it does to stay alive is one of the most quietly astonishing things in all of nature. Down at the bottom, the water is so cold and so pressurized that calcium carbonate, the material that shells and bones are built from, actually dissolves. It will not stay solid. Which raises a question that sounds impossible. How does a creature with a shell survive in a place where shells fall apart? The answer, for the amphipod that rules the Challenger Deep, is that it builds itself a different kind of armor. It pulls aluminum out of the seawater around it and uses it to coat and reinforce its own body, a metal shield, manufactured from the ocean itself, to keep the deep from dissolving it alive. And what it eats is just as strange. When a tree falls into a river thousands of miles away, When wood from a storm or a wreck waterlogs and sinks, it can take months to fall the full distance to the seabed. And waiting down there is this creature, with a rare enzyme in its gut that lets it digest wood, feeding on the remains of a forest it will never see, at the bottom of the world. Food is so scarce at that depth that when something does fall, these scavengers swarm it in enormous numbers and eat until they can barely move, because they may not get another chance for a very long time. It does not live there alone. There are giant single-celled organisms down there too, among the largest single cells anywhere on Earth, some of them the size of your hand, drifting slowly across the sediment. And then there are the microbes. Which brings us to the most recent surprise of all, and the one that should change how you picture that bottom forever. For a long time, scientists assumed the very deepest sediment was close to barren, a cold, starved desert, where only the toughest scraps of life could cling on. Then, in 2025, the most thorough survey of the trench floor ever attempted finally reported its results. A deep-sea submersible had spent dive after dive collecting sediment from miles down across the Haddle Zone. And when the team sequenced what they had pulled up, the number stopped people cold. More than 7,500 different species of microbes. And nearly 90% of them had never been recorded by science before. Not unusual versions of familiar life. Unknown life close to an entire ecosystem we had no idea was there, thriving under more pressure than almost anything on the planet can survive. One of the researchers, watching from inside the submersible as its lights came on at the bottom, described seeing not an empty desert but living things glowing in the dark and drifting through the beam, a place far more alive than anyone had dared to expect. Sit with that for a second. We sent people to the bottom of the ocean before we had any real idea what was living there. We measured the floor before we ever met its inhabitants. And it is not a small gap in our knowledge to this day. Only about a quarter of the entire ocean floor has been mapped in real detail. The deepest place on Earth is not empty. It is one of the least understood ecosystems anywhere on the planet, and we are only now, this decade, beginning to learn its alphabet. But there is one more layer to this. And it is the one that turns the whole story around. Because while the deep was busy hiding thousands of unknown species from us, we were busy sending something down to meet them. In 2017, a research team pulled up amphipods from the bottom of the Mariana Trench, those same tiny scavengers, and tested what was inside their bodies. What they found was pollution. Specifically, a group of toxic industrial chemicals that were banned across much of the world back in the 1970s, because they cause cancer and they do not break down. And the concentrations were not faint traces. By the study's own comparisons, the levels inside these deep-sea creatures rivaled some of the most polluted industrial waters on the surface of the planet, coastlines crowded with factories and outflow pipes. Except this was not a coastline, this was the single most remote spot on Earth. How does poison reach a place almost no human being has ever been? The answer is grimly simple. The trench is a dead end. Everything that falls into the ocean eventually sinks, and a trench is the lowest point there is, so whatever drifts down has nowhere left to go, it simply accumulates. When a contaminated animal nearer the surface dies, its body sinks, carrying its poison with it, and the scavengers at the bottom devour it. The toxins travel down the food chain and down the water column at the same time, and they pool at the deepest point, with no current strong enough to ever flush them out again. The bottom of the world is, in a sense, the planet's final drain. And it is not only invisible chemicals. When that explorer reached the bottom in 2019, he looked out through the window of his submersible at the deepest point on Earth, a place fewer people have visited than have left the planet entirely, and he saw a plastic bag. And the wrappers from someone's food. Later studies found that effectively every single amphipod they tested, from the deepest reaches of the trench, had a piece of synthetic material inside it. The bottom of the world is already full of us. So go back to where we started. We do not know exactly how deep it is, and we may never pin down the final number, because the deepest place on Earth is too vast and too dark to measure perfectly. We did not know, until a few years ago, that thousands of unnamed species were living in its mud. There are no fish in the deepest stretch, only a creature the size of your finger that armors itself in metal and feeds on sunken wood in the blackness. We reached the bottom of the world before we understood almost anything inside it. And by the time we finally got there, our garbage had already arrived ahead of us. The deepest place on Earth was never empty, and it was never clean, only out of sight. So here is the question worth holding on to. If the most remote, most hostile, least visited place on the entire planet is already full of the things we throw away, then where, exactly, did we ever imagine it was all going? Subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you on Uncharted Depths.